Connor?
Yes, Steve?
There's the city heat, there's the county heat, there's the state heat. I think I see 2 cats from Interpol Man, and I know I saw 4 Mounties. Folks, welcome back to Radio Rialto as we continue our journey through the 5 theatrical film directorial efforts of one Sir Robert Fosse. When today we talk about Lenny from the year of our Lord Connor
1974.
Bingo. Bob Fosse beat Francis Ford Coppola for director at the 1973 Oscars, Cabaret over Godfather. And then this year, Coppola did him over, won both director and picture for Godfather Part 2. Lenny's IMDb Wikipedia page is pretty slim. There's not a lot of material out for this movie, but it does state that it's one of like 43 movies to get the big 5 nominations of director, picture, actor, actress, screenplay. So got all 5 nominations, won none of them, got no additional nominations. But there's only been like 43 movies that have at least gotten those 5 nominations. And then obviously the 3 movies that won them all. It Happened One Night, Cuckoo's Nest, and Silence of the Lambs. Connor, what is your experience with both the film Lenny and let's go into Lenny Bruce as well. Let's just talk about Lenny Bruce.
My experience with the film is I heard it was good and it was directed by Bob Fosse. And obviously it's mentioned, like I've mentioned 1,000 times, in Fosse Verdon, which I've seen now like 2.5 times.
Yeah.
And then my experience with Lenny Bruce is actually quite embarrassing because I didn't know he existed until Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. And for a little bit, I thought he was made up for that show.
Connor, I'm so glad you said that. In fact, my question was a direct setup because I knew you were going to say that. For a brief moment, I want to talk about last night. I did a homework exercise. I was like, we're going to be watching Lenny, which I had seen. Well, I'll get into my experience with Lenny Bruce later. We're going to be watching Lenny, and there's only one other big screen representation of Lenny Bruce. And that is The Marvelous Miss Maisel. And last night, before I watched Lenny, I watched the episode that Luke Kirby won his Emmy for playing Lenny Bruce, which is the season 2 finale. He won a guest star Emmy. There's like 20-something episodes of that show, and he's in like 9 of them. And the season 2 finale, he won the guest star Emmy. And I want to talk... I want to use this, as my one major criticism of that entire show, a show I like a lot, is the inclusion of Lenny Bruce. Because I think it is, does not fit the tone of the show at all. And B, is kind of a disgraceful use of his image. Lenny Bruce was such a unique performer and figure in American culture that his energy, his dynamic, is impossible to replicate. And that's something that we'll talk about more later on. So Luke Kirby, good actor I like a lot, trying his best. He's not Lenny Bruce, and the show doesn't allow him to create really a character. Lenny is used as this like figure to talk about comedy and the time as a whole. It's a very like Forrest Gumpy Mad Men sort of like inclusion of that show, which is so crazy because Mrs. Maisel, despite obviously talking about the culture of the late 50s and early 60s as a sort of reflection point of culture today, is rarely topical in the way that something like Forrest Gump and Mad Men using these pieces of iconography. Like Mrs. Maisel, they're not talking about the Kennedys a whole bunch. It's mostly just like, yeah, it's the late 50s, early 60s in New York, and we're just kind of living our lives. People smoke a lot, and there are clubs, and people dress in formal wear, this, that, and the other thing. But for the most part, the show, it's more about the characters. And so often, I feel like they use Lenny Bruce as a mouthpiece. So it's like, stand-up comedy is so hard to translate into, like, fiction. it's like such a unique type of performance that is so about a performer and the audience right there in the moment. To hire an actor play a stand-up comedian is just like it's not the same thing. Their like backgrounds as performers are totally different, so it's like a performance within a performance, and like the bridge almost never fully works. I think Brosnahan, for my money, is actually one of the actors I've seen who performs quote unquote stand up in a fictional context the best. But I feel like they include Lenny Bruce just as a way. It was like, how is the audience supposed to know that Midge is funny? Because Lenny Bruce, one of the most important comics in American history, thinks she's funny, which I think is insulting to his legacy. To sort of plop him to this fictional world, and it was like, oh, Midge did this thing because Lenny did this thing, and Lenny did this thing because Midge told him to. Like, it's just such a weird puppet use of his corpse and his image and his legacy. And I think it's also kind of insulting to Midge because like that Luke Kirby character does not have to be Lenny Bruce. And that episode ends with them Forrest Gump style recreating a set that he did on the Tonight Show with Steve Allen. They like recreated the set, like he's doing the actual, like after I watched the episode, I watched that 13-minute segment that they're recreating. And then I watched the movie, and it's just like, it's not the same. Like, Luke Kirby does not have Lenny Bruce's energy, because no one has Lenny Bruce's energy. He was this weird, like, flare that just showed up and burned out as quickly as he arrived. And also, it's a much more, like, clean-cut Lenny Bruce. There is never, like, oh, Lenny, he's lived a hard life. There's never an indication that this guy's a heroin addict on that show.
No.
Because that obviously not, because it's a nice, wholesome show that doesn't stray away from, like, realities of the world and of the time. Racism, sexism, such as that. But it's not, it's equally a comedy as it is a drama, and they're not going to bring in a heroin addict to derail that tone. So don't use Lenny Bruce. Use a basically fictional character that you're already using anyway. And don't do it. It's my only major complaint of that show is, why does that character have to be Lenny Bruce? Why can't it be a Lenny Bruce type? Obviously, we all know what he's supposed to be. Just let the audience accept it and move on. It is my one huge problem with that show. A show I like it quite a bit. So as someone whose introduction to Lenny Bruce was that show, how does he compare in your mind to the Lenny that you saw in this movie?
Well, I learned that real Lenny Bruce was not like Lenny Bruce and Miss Maisel, like not too long after realizing he was a real person.
Yeah.
But then seeing the Dustin Hoffman version, I assume, is a lot closer. I see more of like the actual person Lenny Bruce was.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about Dustin Hoffman, pretty dang good in this movie.
Before we dive into Hoffman, I did some brief research. There's not a lot of material about this movie. Basically, obviously, it says in the credits it's based on a play. It's one of those funny things where I looked it up, and it turns out in the late 60s, after Lenny Bruce died in 1966. And in the years later, they sorted out with the estate, Honey and his mother. Columbia Pictures bought the film rights, and they went to this up-and-coming playwright named Julian Barry, and they said, we're interested in making the film. And he wrote the screenplay. And then apparently the movie Love Story came out, and Columbia's like, we're making romances, which Lenny is not a romance. And so it just sort of got sidelined. And one of his friends was just like, we could turn this into a play. So they did. Barry adapted his screenplay into a stage play, and he directed himself off-Broadway. Actually, I think it started off-Broadway and then moved to Broadway. The actor who played Lenny in the show won the Tony. Did not get cast in the film. Dustin Hoffman got cast instead. But then he was later cast in All That Jazz, in a minor part, which I think is a nice touch. It's a very nice Menchie move of Fosse. The movie came out, was critically well received. It got nominated for a bunch of Oscars. Financially did okay. And then mostly just sort of exists. The legacy of this movie is not that it's fairly notable. It's like, oh, Bob Fosse, Dustin Hoffman, nominated for a bunch of Oscars, biopic of this very important American cultural figure. But it doesn't really get talked about. It didn't enter the canon in the way that something like Cabaret and All That Jazz did, which is funny because it's sandwiched right in between them. And I think the main legacy of this film is within the comedy community. It was like they didn't get Lenny right. Like the sort of was just like Dustin Hoffman like spent like a year like studying like not only the old tapes and recordings of Bruce, but just watching stand-up comedians in general. And then after the movie came out, he got dinner with two of the comics that he was like shadowing, and he was like, how do you think I did? And they're just like, nah, it just wasn't that. Like, comedians are very, very critical of this movie because sort of what I was talking about with Miss Maisel, Lenny Bruce is such this unique figure to even attempt to try to recreate that magic as sort of a futile sort of quest. It's a very Sisyphean sort of thing. You're never quite going to get there. And I will say that I think, for the most part, as a biopic of Lenny Bruce, the artist, I don't think it's entirely successful. I think Hoffman is doing what I think is very wise of Hoffman is that he's not doing a direct Lenny Bruce impression, which the Luke Kirby performance is more of an impression. But Hoffman is taking the energy that is within Bruce's words, adapted by Barry, but Bruce's ideas, and sort of trying to sort of capture the tone and the intonation and the weight that Bruce gave it without directly sort of copying his mannerisms, which is an impossible task. And the thing about Dustin Hoffman is that he's delivering these jokes and he's funny. And that's sort of the thing I'm talking about Rachel Brosnahan. When she delivers those jokes, even though they're not her material, it's not her material, this is not material she's cultivated herself, she delivers the jokes well. And, that's at least something. What I will say is that I do think that wisely Bob Fosse approached this material, and I think it is a very good biopic of Lenny Bruce, the man. Because when you get down to it, I think this movie is probably just as much about Bob Fosse as it is about Lenny Bruce. I think Fosse was just like, oh, another self-destructive perfectionist artist who flew a little too close to the sun. I know what to do with this.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of his films you see parallels to his life.
To the point where we'll talk about it next week, but all that jazz
Yes.
it's just him, and it's about the editing of this movie.
Yes.
Do you have any additional thoughts on Hoffman? It's a great performance. It's an incredible performance.
It's a great performance, and I see a little bit of there's just ever so slight impression stuff. I get that because I like to see like intersects of him and Kirby's performance.
Yeah,
like just the way the intonation of words. I feel like obviously the actual man said things that way. And there's even some bits that are used in Maisel that are, obviously in this movie because they're real Lenny Bruce bits.
Lenny Bruce has certain, he was a New York Jew, so, there's certain, beats that you can hit. And I think Hoffman does go there, but it's not like when he's off stage, it's not like he's still doing the same thing. There's, it's basically Dustin Hoffman playing really confident, self-destructive guy. Mm-hmm. It's not like he's always on.
Yeah.
And I think the parts where he's the most electric is just whenever he's not talking. Anytime he's in the court and he just has to sulk and watch and observe everything. When he winks at the old lady towards the end, that shit's electric.
No, Hoffman's just really good. I don't really have much to say about his performance.
No. Next, playing Honey, Valerie Perrine, Oscar nominated for this film.
She's great.
Exceptional. It's a brilliant, beautiful, devastating performance. Bob Fosse, as much as he could be a rat bastard, I feel like is a very underrated director of actresses. Because we are 3 for 3 of exceptional female performances with McLean, Minnelli, and Perrine. I don't know what it is. I don't know. And obviously he had this beautiful, as tumultuous as it was personally, this beautiful professional relationship with Verdun. I don't know. I think there is something about Bob Fosse that I think he observed women as performers and as artists with a level of respect that not many male directors of his generation did. And I think a lot of that comes down to, like, he didn't have a dad, right? Wasn't he mostly raised by women?
He had a dad. For I got his dad was just not a great guy at all. I just think that relationship wasn't great.
And he mostly grew up in, like, clubs around female dancers and...
Yeah, and learning to tap dance with, like, other girls.
Yeah. I think there is just something to, like, him entering, being one of the few men in a female world, and then rising up to a level of power where he was a man's world. Theater on the lower levels, and this is in a lot of the arts. In the lower levels, it's littered with women, but any of those most powerful positions, they're always sort of placated by men. I mean, that's just part of... I don't need to dissect the patriarchy. And I think he was just able to... I don't know what it is. I think he was just able to something to tap into his background. I think I think it's very apparent, like, he has a level of respect for these women and their intelligence and their emotional intelligence, especially because, like, a character like Sally Bowles in the wrong hands, like, would be an insufferable fetishistic manic pixie dream girl thing, and that performance is so human. And obviously a lot of that is Minnelli. We talked about that a lot last episode, but I think a lot of that is Fosse allowing that space for Minnelli to provide that with that character. And the same thing with Honey is just, like, on the surface, like, she's a stripper, she's a heroin addict, she's completely self-destructive, she's not that attentive as a mother. Like, a lot of directors would view this character with a level of judgment, and Fosse is basically painting her as, like, no, this is a deeply flawed, hurt person who has a good heart. And I think Valley Perrine is able to deliver that in spades.
I completely agree.
All right. For this next one, I'm gonna let you lead. I'm gonna give you the runway. Jan Miner, who plays Sally, Lenny's mother.
Oh, okay. Here's the thing. She's great. That's what I say every single time. First, she's great.
She's really fucking good.
I feel like, obviously, I know, like, 1,000 women like her, and I feel that, like, your mom is exactly like her. You'll have to cut that out, but
Oh my god.
But I just know 1,000 moms like her. Yeah. She has a great energy. I tell her she's a great woman. She really cares for her son, and she really wants the best for him. No. And she's a goofy lady.
It's just another one of those things. It would be so easy to, like, portray her as this, like, nagging, like, Jewish, like, overbearing, like, what are you doing? This, like, pushing, but she is so... It just has this beautiful energy of just, like, she probably became a mother a little too young.
Yeah.
And never fully tapped into that instinct, and probably treated Lenny as a small child as just, like, an adult person.
Yes.
And probably pushed them into things a little too early. But she always just has her own, like, agency and life, and she's so sexy. She just has this beautiful, like, confidence. It was like, yeah, you created that. This checks out. And you can like, there are certain, like, especially because this is a role that society kind of pushes women into first, where it's just like, there are certain women who they're mothers first and individuals second. Yeah. And with the character of Sally, it is the exact opposite. She's an individual first, and one of my many jobs is that I'm a mother to this kid.
Exactly.
I love her bit. It was like, if a Protestant mother went out and, like, flew out across the country to help her son raise his kid, you would never say, oh, what a Protestant mother thing to do. But what can I say? I'm a Jewish mother. And, like, she totally flips it around. It was like, oh, yes, sense of humor is not hereditary in terms of genetic, but obviously this was an environment that he, like, jokes and humor and flipping things on their head was an environment that this young kid grew up in, and that's how he became the most influential comic of his generation. Because he had this... Because, like, I feel like I have a pretty good sense of humor, and I feel like it's because I find both my parents to be funny.
Exactly. Same case for me. Yeah. Where I'm only as weird as I am because my dad is a wild man.
Yeah. She is not this, like, maternal martyr Madonna figure. She's a person who had to be in charge of this kid and then had to be in charge of his kid.
Yeah.
And it's just one of those things. It would be very easy for her to just, like, open, like constantly knock down Honey, or just like, oh god, this girl, this, that, and the other thing. But that introduction dinner scene with the grandmother as well, she's just like, they get along like that because Honey can keep up with the bit.
Exactly.
And the level, it was like, if you can get the bit, there is a certain level of respect I have for you. I like you because you
Poor
can keep
Nemo.
up with our pace. Yeah. Oh god, I love the seagull.
Seagull's great.
And it was one of those things where it's just like, I feel like I vaguely recognize this woman. She did not do a lot of movies, did a good chunk of TV. I think she was mostly a theater actress. But then when I looked at her Wikipedia, she is most known. She, for like 20 years, was like one of the lead spokesmen for Palmolive dishwashing detergent. She had a character named Madge, and she was like, she did like, did nails. And like the whole idea was like Palmolive won't ruin your nails, and like Palmolive is very sensitive and won't mess with your skin. It was just like this incredible performance. It was like, obviously I don't want to dismiss actors who mainly work get their living in commercials, but it's just like, it's crazy that she's giving this incredible, in my opinion, Oscar nomination worthy performance, and she is mostly known as like a soap spokesman. Like, that's her photo on IMDb, and like that is the headline of her IMDb. Most known for playing Madge the nail dresser.
Was that before or after Lenny?
Both. It was before and
it's a
after.
long time, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like opposite. That seems like very much like a 1960s ad for like meant for housewives. Like, washing dishes won't ruin your nails.
Yeah.
It's a very direct like marketing technique.
No, her Wikipedia photo is like a Madge commercial from like the 80s, and she has like full 80s hair. She has shoulder pads. Yeah. There's a bunch of different supporting cast members. Like, this movie is so... It's basically a series of vignettes that has a narrative tied together through these interview segments. That was one of the things... I never talked about my experience with this movie. My experience with this movie is that I was a comedy nerd and a film nerd. As I was getting into both these things, I was listening to a lot of George Carlin and Richard Pryor and such in high school. It was everything I kept running. Lenny Bruce, huge influence on both of them. Lenny Bruce obviously paved the way for not only comedy, but basically freedom of speech in this country. There are so many things that we as a culture have evolved beyond, largely due to Lenny Bruce and then the people he influenced him, to the point where George Carlin's most famous bit, the bit that closes his album, the 7 words that you can't say on television, if you were to air that bit now on network television, only 5 of the words get bleeped.
Yeah, wild.
Yeah. Goddamn and tits you can now say on network television. But the other 5 are still. So it's just like, that's the difference that 40 years makes. And that ball started rolling because Lenny Bruce 15 years before that. And then as I was getting to movies, it was just like, all right, there's a Lenny Bruce movie. Oh, it stars Dustin Hoffman. He's an important actor I've heard of. And it's directed by the choreographer Bob Fosse. This might have been to my introduction to the notion that Bob Fosse was a director. And then I watched that. I'm like, that movie's wild. I didn't know you could intermix like documentary. Like, I know obviously those are actors, but they're treating it like it's documentary, and it feels like a documentary. I didn't know you could do that in a movie. Just shit like that. Like, this was probably around the time that I saw Richard Linklater's Bernie, which is another movie that brilliantly ties documentary techniques with narrative filmmaking, except they use people who actually lived through it, interviewed them, and then also used them as extras and bit players throughout the movie. Yeah, this movie's gorgeous. The black and white photography, it's so high contrast. Like, it's like, there's a lot of black and white movies where it's like, it's black and white, but it's really just a lot of patches of gray. This is black and white. Like, there's dark backgrounds and hot spotlights. And there are some shots of I'm watching this, and it was like shots where they're talking in a car, and I'm like, this looks like a dream.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't even process as reality, which I think is a brilliant thing of, like, because it's like, it's coming right off of a performance. So I feel like Bob Fosse knows that thing was like, when you're walking off stage, like, there's that statistic where the amount of adrenaline that an actor feels walking off the stage is the same amount of adrenaline a normal person would get if they got hit by a train. Like, that's what performers do to their bodies on a nightly basis. So you walk off that stage and you are in this, like, weird sort of, like, I need to come down from this. I need to, like, slowly enter myself back into the real world. And I think Bob Fosse, who has lived on both sides of that curtain, is able to capture that beautifully. How did you watch Lenny?
I had a Prime Video rental in SD.
Okay. I watched it on Pluto TV because it was free and I had seen it before. And watching this movie interrupted by commercials every 10 minutes is a very unique experience. Because it's one of those things, it's just one of those things where it's just like, technically, I can't argue that this commercial placement isn't good because it is the end of this scene, and when we come back, we are onto a new thing. But it's just that this movie is so staccato and just filled with little moments in vignettes that you could put a commercial almost anywhere and it would work, but that doesn't mean it should. It is very startling to just be in this very stark, like dreadful pressure, black and white of this world, and then just cut to a commercial about like hot water heaters, and like Rob Riggle trying to sell home insurance to veterans.
Yeah. See, I was gonna watch this on Pluto TV.
Yeah.
And I went on Pluto TV last night, and I like clicked their accept like cookie thing, and my antivirus screamed at me. Steven, this is not a bit. 120 like pop up like this is a bad, get off now. Because apparently no diss Pluto TV. I think it was just my antivirus overreacting. But they apparently had phishing scams happen a while ago.
That sounds about right.
So I had like an 120 like different click windows like this is a phishing scam. Don't use this website.
Yeah, but you don't have to like you can sign up for Pluto, but you could also use it for free.
I know.
If you don't give
I
them
just got
your
off
email.
the site because when your antivirus gives you 120 warnings.
Yeah.
I was like, maybe I just shouldn't. Maybe I should spend the $3.99 to not worry about that.
I was watching it on my Xbox, so I didn't have to worry about phishing scams.
Yeah, I should have just downloaded the app on my PS4, but I was like, whatever. I guess like peace of mind. I won't worry about that anymore. But yeah, so I was wondering because I was watching this movie, and it's gorgeous to the point in SD it still looks incredible.
Yeah.
And I was like, I really wished I had the hindsight to buy the Blu-ray when it was still with Twilight Time, like however many years ago.
Well, that was like 7 years ago now, and
Yeah,
also
so I guess
it's one of those
the
things.
hindsight wouldn't exist, but
And also, I think that one went quick. Like there were certain Twilight Time titles that just went like that,
I'm sure.
and there were other ones that just sort of lingered.
Oh, you know how I learned about Lenny Bruce?
Where?
Rent. Lenny Bruce, Langston Hughes.
One name drop. I have one last actor written on my list. And his name is Bob Fosse.
Yes.
Bob Fosse plays the interviewer, which is such a fun little detail. And he's good. Like you can hear him in the background. He's giving a performance. It's not like he's just reading questions. Because there's that bit, it was like, what kind of stick? No, shtick, honey. Shtick.
No, he's a really good actor. The little bits we see of him.
Yeah. Hear of him. Never see him.
Hear of him. There's he's in this movie where it's this, I don't know, I feel bad calling it weird, but it's this weird thing where he plays a guy like the Snake Man or something.
The Little Prince. The live-action Little Prince
Okay,
adaptation.
it's a live-action Little Prince. Okay, because I've seen that clip, and he's really good in that clip.
Yeah.
It's a wild little
scary.
performance. He's terrifying.
He's scary. And he has to dance. They say because like a lot of Michael Jackson's dancing stuff, like he appropriated from like 6 different things. Like obviously like street dancing culture. That's where the moonwalk came from. He took a lot of stuff from Fred Astaire. A lot of the hats and the like so much of that is Fosse. And they would cite that movie explicitly. Like Michael Jackson would play that reel over and over, watching that snake dance specifically.
Okay.
So much of that
was a
is
Snake
like,
Man? Was I right about that?
I think he plays a snake. Yeah, I've never read The Little Prince.
Yeah, I'll have to watch that clip again sometime.
Au Bois Prix or whatever the French is.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else? We've done all. This is the least amount of notes I've ever written for one of these.
Oh, Steve, my notes literally are the stand-up segments, Dustin Hoffman. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah, because we talked about the photography a little bit. I mean, it's stark black and white. The editing, interesting.
Yeah.
Very frenetic. A lot of the time, Bob Fosse is not dealing with a direct reality. He's more capturing mood. The party where Lenny and Honey interact for the first time, I feel like, is the ultimate example. It's a lot of like close-ups on people, like just being kind of like, you can tell it's like the part where like the party has peaked and now no one wants to go home, but everyone probably should. Yeah. So it's just a lot of just like languid like close-ups on people just sort of looking off into the distance and like and you see someone having a little conversation in the background.
No, the most smooth flirtation I've ever seen in cinema is the toothbrush glass full of liquor, just passing a tour between the guy's legs.
Yeah.
Does get any smoother.
Yeah. But also it's just like that happens so fast, but Fosse has such and Surtees, Bob Surtees, who also shot Sweet Charity, right? Also famous is like the cinematographer from everything from Ben-Hur to The Graduate. So like legendary cameraman. They have such a keen sense of geography that despite it being a lot of tight close-ups, this movie, a good chunk of the dialogue scenes in this movie are just close-ups. Where Fosse really wants to hone in on the performances, and he uses wides very, very sparingly, primarily in club scenes, and usually when he wants you to feel uncomfortable. Usually when Lenny's bombing is when you see big wides. The other one, where he really goes into the wide, is actually the exact opposite. Is that tirade where he goes through like every racial and ethnic slur that he could, and he's talking about how if you repeat the word, it strips it of his power. It's basically the centerpiece of the entire movie, where it's this one example where we go into the wide so we can see everyone in the audience proving Lenny's point that is directly contrasting to the point 20 minutes earlier and like 40 minutes later, where especially because like his big ultimate bomb where he's completely hopped up on heroin and he's bombing and he's in the bathrobe is one single wide shot for like a 4.5 minute period or something crazy like that.
I think it's even longer than that.
It feels like an eternity, but
it does. That's very true.
But yeah, it's just one of those things where it's just like, I know 35 millimeter like cartridges only have like a 10-minute limit. Like they had to use like a fresh cartridge every time, right? Because who knows how long this is gonna go.
Probably, yeah.
You can't like start a new take and hope that it will be done by the end of the cartridge.
That's a very good point.
The editing at the end, like at the very end, where it's like a very just like this line, this piece of information, recreation of the police photograph on the scene of Lenny Bruce's death. It's just like a very intense. The agent's thing was like, I'm talking about selling the film rights for his life story now, which like in any other filmmaker would be the ultimate like wink wink. But Bob Fosse turns into a big fuck you to the system that he's working in to begin with to make this movie.
Yeah,
in its own way, a very Lenny Bruce moment. Because Lenny Bruce was constantly like trying to fight against the system, but obviously he needed to work within it, and that was his ultimate downfall, is that he couldn't work within it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which there's like, yes, did that improve his artistic integrity? Yeah. Did it also kind of ruin his life? Also, yeah. You got to find that balance to make it work. It's unfortunately, it's one of those. Roger Ebert's review of this movie is really interesting, because he was in the minority. He was not a huge fan of it. He gave it a 2.5, and he basically, his entire thesis of the film is so like, Lenny Bruce was obviously a very unique figure in his time, and this movie is bringing a lot of attention to his work again, where his records are available on sale again. This is obviously a review written in 1974. And it was like, basically, the entire case this film is trying to make can only be made if you really believe that Lenny Bruce was an important performer. Which in like reading the review now, was a fascinating take, because I don't disagree with him. Obviously now we have the following 50, 60 years worth of history where we know he was a very important performer, because he influenced like 12 different people who influenced like another like every generation has the residual effects of what he started. But at the time, it was only like 8 years after his death. Like his legacy was not fully solidified yet. In a lot of ways, this film continued that solidification of his legacy. And basically, it was like, if you don't buy into the hype of Lenny Bruce, I don't know, he's just kind of a little shit. Like, that's what... But that's a lot of these performances. Like, even, like... Arguably, the closest thing we have to a Lenny Bruce now is, I don't know, Sacha Baron Cohen?
Yeah.
As, like, provocateur? I feel like there's a short list of, like, maybe 5 guys that you could throw into the ring as a Lenny Bruce. But none of them rise up to the plate, especially because, like, I don't know, we've seen it all. Like, there's less shock. We're exposed to everything. 12-year-olds are watching pornography. They're blowing up people's heads in Call of Duty. Like, there's and, like, the cultural residual, like, exposure. When Lenny Bruce was doing stand-up, this was at a time where there was still, like, a legion of decency, where people was like, if this movie got a B, you're a C, you can't see it. And we just don't have those firm moral grounds anymore. And I don't think that's a bad thing.
No.
But it's just much harder to, like, really poke at things. Which, if anything, I feel like has led to this sort of, like, because it is so hard to, like, poke at something and really bother someone, it now inherently has to be political.
Yeah.
The only thing that really still riles people up that way is things that are deemed political, which Lenny Bruce was doing as well, yet a lot of the things he was talking about, race, sexism, double standards when we talk about sexuality, homophobia, those all still exist, but there's an additional several layers of context on top of them. So I don't know, who would it even be today? I argue it's like either Sacha Baron Cohen or John Oliver. But John Oliver, like, speaks to such a specific... Like everyone has their sort of own echo chamber now. We have less of a monoculture. People talked about Lenny Bruce because he was the person to talk about. Whereas John Oliver isn't being watched by the right-wing people that he's making fun of. Like, he's pretty much just preaching to the liberal leftist choir that he aligns with.
That's true, yeah. I cannot think of any parallels, really. Because I guess I see the Sacha Baron Cohen thing, obviously.
Because, like, Borat, like, obviously, like, it's the little stinker thing, but there is a cultural, like, like, the Rudy Giuliani thing. Like, that was deemed, like, an important political moment of the year.
Yeah.
And it's just him doing a pretty dumb bit.
Yeah.
And I think about, like, 40 years later, a lot of these bits are still provocative.
Yeah.
And they're not delivered in a way they would be delivered today, but the core of what he's trying to get at, a lot of it still applies.
It's a very good point.
It's basically an impossible task to make a biopic that encapsulates all of his output as an artist. But I think Fosse does well to capture that frantic thing. I will say my one major complaint is that, this is my complaint with most biopics that are like the rise and fall, I'm always way less interested in the fall. It's just like, all right, yeah. I get it. Can we get out of here? Yeah, yep, he overdoses there. It's really sad. I gotta go home. I gotta pay the babysitter. I gotta put the kids to bed.
Because I was not amazed, not the right word for it, but I was surprised just how conventional this really is at the end of the day.
I mean, it's just like, you can try all these aesthetic things with the camera work and the editing and like obscene language, this, that, and the other thing, but like, there's only so much you could do with a biopic.
Yeah.
There's only so much you could do with a movie. There's only like 17 stories that can be told to begin with.
Exactly, yeah. Because when I was watching it, other than like the cutaways to the stand-up and obviously the documentary stuff, it just felt very like just straightforward like biopic stuff, like performance artist biopic.
Yeah.
Where it's obviously
he gets
doesn't
a
do
manager.
very well. Yeah.
Gets a manager, has that one big night, has a downfall. He's at his lowest. Somehow from his lowest, he goes to his absolute career peak.
Where it's like, like I said, there's only 17 stories that can be told, and when you're at our point where we've watched literally thousands of movies, sometimes that bothers you more than it should.
Yeah.
But
I will say I do love the scene because the movie like jumps all throughout the timeline of his life, and there's that one scene, and Fosse and Barry with his screenplay are mainly making thematic connections in his life, and the bits that they choose, because a lot of it is later Bruce material interspersed with early Bruce life. And it's because that material has a direct literary connection with what was going on in his life at that time. I do love, at a point where Lenny is at his lowest, they show him with the beard later in his life. And then, like, it's on, like I said, it's mediums and wides, mostly on Lenny. You rarely get an indication of how the audience feels, unless Fosse is like, in this moment, I'm going to tell you exactly how one audience member is feeling. And you just see the club is empty, except for, like, 3 different people. And the guy just leans to his friend, like, what a bore. Because he's just ranting about his different trials, and he's just reading from the transcripts, and it's just, like, he's not even making jokes. It's just, he's just talking. It's like this open forum therapy session for him.
Exactly. Where he directly even says, obviously, when the people get up to leave, he says these are the jokes referring to the U.S. Justice system.
I think there is a point that Ebert is making in his review. It's just like Bruce is viewed as this martyr of American culture, but that martyrdom was sort of like a self-appointed prophecy.
Yeah,
that he really sort of played into himself and was fairly narcissistic as a performer, as artists tend to be. I feel like the difference is that I feel like a lot of people would agree that Bruce had the goods to back it up, but if you're like not into his whole thing, then you're not going to be into his whole thing. It's like you're on board or you're not. There's very little that he can do to win you over. I think I've exhausted about any particular point I could possibly make about Lenny Bruce. Connor, do you have any final thoughts?
Well, it's very random, but this movie reminded me of The People versus Larry Flint. Better movie, obviously, but there's times I was just thinking about that a couple times. Yeah,
and The People versus Larry Flint, despite, Milos Forman having his, experimental streak, and, Karaszewski and Alexander, their whole, thing is, we make biopics about people who would never have a biopic, is the more conventional version of this movie.
Yeah.
Is, the more Hollywood conventional version of this movie. Despite coming from the 3 people who you would... Because, Lenny Bruce is a very important figure, so he would have a biopic. I feel like at some point there would be a Lenny Bruce biopic. I feel like this is the best possible version of that, though. Because it's just all right, it is going to be impossible to fully encapsulate, so let's really dig in on, these 3 things about him. And just try to capture mood. Whereas The People vs. Larry Flint, it has a 3-act structure, and there's lawyers, and the rise and fall and rise, and he gets in a wheelchair, and it's just it is a much more traditional Hollywood sort of Oscar Beatty version of this type of story.
Yeah.
No, that's a very good connection. I didn't think about that when I was watching the movie, mainly because that's not a movie I particularly think about a lot.
No, it's not a good movie, but I think about it sometimes.
It's fine. It's a 3-star movie. It's got some good scenes. Connor?
Yes, Steve?
I want to thank you for joining me on this journey once again.
Thank you for having me.
We are over the hump. We just got 2 more. There's less in front of us than there is behind.
That's true.
That's crazy. And until we start another one of these things. Until I make you commit to all the James Bond movies. 20-something movies. Let's go.
We have All That Jazz and Star 80 coming up.
God, I've Star 80. What a way to go. Fuck. I forgot to watch Liza with a Z. I meant to watch Liza with a Z.
Oh.
There's still time. Connor?
Yes, Steve?
Until next time when we rouge our knees and pull our stockings down when we watch
All That Jazz.
I want to thank you all again for joining us here at Radio Rialto. For more, please join us next time when we continue More Smoke, Please, the 5 directorial films of one Robert Fosse.
Well, Steve, the odds against us reached 100 to 1.
Connor, those are the best odds I've ever had. All right, you ready to clap? Eleanor Roosevelt gave Lou Gehrig the clap.
Ready?
3, 2, 1. It's pretty close on my end.
I scared the shit out of Bucky, but
Did you not like my Lenny reference?
I did. Yes, I did. Like, I was drinking water and focusing on the clap.
Thank you. Eleanor Roosevelt gave. Unsurprisingly, when I was going through quotes for my opening line, it was like on the IMDb page, it is impossible to find a quote from this movie that is not either 2 paragraphs long and also like riddled with obscenities.
Yeah.
Which is kind of the point, but I found one. Yeah.
I mean, oh dang! I feel terrible. The name of the actress who played his wife, Honey, in this.
Oh, Valerie Perrine.
See, she was good, but she's no Courtney Love. I will say.
God, I forgot that Courtney Love's in that movie. Talk about someone I actively try not to think about. Jesus.
Yeah, I had to put that bit in there. Which I don't mind Courtney Love in that movie too much.
I mean, I mind Courtney Love, but
yeah,
that's a tale for another day. When we eventually do our Courtney Love miniseries,
yeah,
Sid and Nancy.
We talk about Strange Days, whatever the Gus Van Sant movie's called.
What Gus Van Sant movie is she in?
His Kurt Cobain movie.
Oh, I was eventually gonna make the joke montage of Heck.
Oh, montage of Heck.
I said Sid and Nancy, the People versus Lenny Flint, and montage of Heck. You ever see a montage in Heck?
No.
That's a movie that just makes me fucking angry.
No, we didn't watch the movie where Michael Pitt plays Kurt Cobain.
God, no thanks. No thanks. No, thank you. And the funny thing is, I'm not even that big of a Kurt Cobain fan. I don't love Nirvana at all. I'm a loser and a dork who likes Foo Fighters. Shove me in a locker, I dare you. But just Courtney Love, Jesus fuck, monster. I hate her. Oh, this is getting cut.
I'd be cool. Well, here's the thing. You can't do it now because it's not time when I work out. But I wouldn't be against the Craigs. But
I think if we really wanted to, we could do one of each Bond. I think that would be the best possible way that we could do this.
Yes, I'm not against that.
Like you do Goldfinger, like Live and Let Die, or like I would say like you would have to pick one from each Bond that is the most that Bond.
Yeah.
Because like for Craig, I would say Casino Royale over Skyfall. Because Skyfall is like a very James Bond movie, but Casino Royale is like a very Daniel Craig James Bond movie.
Yes.
So
it is also just the best one.
Yeah, I would say it's probably the best movie, but probably not the best James Bond movie. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense, yeah.
Just like how I always say that A Muppet Christmas Carol is arguably the best Muppet movie, but not the best Muppet movie.
Yes. It's the best movie starring James Bond, but it's not the best James Bond movie. Yeah. Yeah.
Just like Fast and Furious 6 is the best Fast and Furious movie, even if it's not the best movie. What the fuck were we talking about before we got to James Bond? So Connor, until next time when we're talking about
all that jazz.
I should have made a joke. I should have been like, put your stockings on.
I had to rouge our knees and pull our stockings down.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you just want to take it over?
All right, yeah.